So good morning, everybody. I'm Olivia Walch. Let me start off by saying how much I enjoyed yesterday's presentations and also Gregory's from half an hour ago. I was really blown away. I think there's a lot of things I'm going to be stealing, especially from Beth's presentation in terms of introducing models and talking about modeling. A little bit of background on me. I did my applied math PhD with Danny Forger at the University of Michigan, and I'm currently appointed in neurology there. I'm also an app developer, but my day-to-day salary actually comes from a grant to my startup, Archoscope. So in terms of conflict of interest, that's my conflict of interest. Obviously keep that in mind in all of the slides I show you today, but I've got a couple at the end that explicitly reference my business, and I've marked those so you know when they happen. All right, what am I going to talk about today? Well, I'm going to start out by talking about putting circadian models on phones. What happens when you try to do that? I'm going to do a brief snapshot of the state of consumer wearables in 2021. I'm going to talk about how you can make a proxy for light from non-light signals and what that looks like when you try and predict shift work or DILMA from that. And then very briefly at the end, talk about what I think is next for this space and for translating circadian models in the real world. I'm at the far end of the spectrum in terms of actually trying to get models into the hands of people who maybe don't necessarily know very much about what circadian rhythms are. But let's start with clocks on phones. So to get everybody on the same page, we've got the human circadian clock kept in sync with its environment, predominantly by light, and we can model that human circadian clock as a limit cycle oscillator, something that oscillates but is also stretchy and robust. And many such models are based on one limit cycle oscillator called the van der Pol oscillator. There's a bunch that fall under the category of a van der Pol limit cycle oscillator model of the human circadian clock. And you can map outputs of these models to real circadian biomarkers like melatonin, acrophase, or core body temperature minimum. So here is a van der Pol oscillator of the human circadian clock. And for those who are seeing this for maybe the first time, this is a system of differential equations. You can think of that as a set of rules for just updating where you are now to where you are in a very short time from now. And in this model, the light goes right here. So this alpha of I term, that's where you're passing in light history. And I want to make my own analogy for what's going on here, and also argue that it's extremely natural to put models of this kind on phones because it's a system of differential equations, like the physics engines of video games. So a video game has a physics engine that says, oh, okay, you pressed the A button, make the character move this amount in this short period of time. And so this system of differential equations up in the upper right is not that dissimilar from Flappy Bird, a mobile game where you would tap the screen to make your bird go up. And the analogy, your input, your time varying input is pressing your screen in Flappy Bird, whereas in the model, it's the light history you're passing. And I include this not just because I came up with it last night and I was like, what an amazing analogy, but also because Flappy Bird came out in 2013. And we're going to flash back to 2014, back when phones all had that gradient effect going on. There was no flat design. And my advisor, Danny Forger, had a paper coming out on optimal control of the human circadian clock. He asked if I could make an app to relay some schedules he had generated in that paper. And I should note that at the time, my entire app making catalog was Bathroom Soundscape, which was an app where you could hit a button and it would play a fan noise. That was all it did. It animated the fan. As an experienced app developer, I said, no problem, Danny, I can definitely make this app. And to be really clear about what optimal schedule meant in this case, well, an optimal schedule was a list of numbers, and these numbers were switch times, times to turn the light on if it was off, or off it was on. And so they would run this code that would spit out a list of numbers, maybe something like 15.2, 29.1. That might mean turn the lights on after 15.2 hours and turn it off after 29.1 hours. And these were only focused on entraining in least time. So they did not care about feasibility. They just cared about getting in sync as quickly as possible with a new time zone. And I think the best way to understand what these actually looked like is to look at a simulation. So I'm going to start by showing you a non-optimal schedule. This is a slam shift, so I'm simulating a 9-hour shift by just starting at a certain point and then abruptly changing my light schedule to be a 9-hour offset of what it was before. And this red dot is going to chase this gray dot and try to get in sync. The gray dot is the target. So playing this video, and red starts out of sync, and it stays out of sync. Really, by the time you hit 100 hours, you're still very offset. In contrast, though, if we simulate the same shift, but with one of the optimal schedules from this paper, that's the blue dot, it entrains much faster. You've got entrainment after like 4 days. So that's what these schedules were designed to do, shift as quickly as possible. The only downside is that there were a lot of them. So you could be shifting many amounts. The maximum brightness of light you could get was an important factor in the schedule you got. And so the paper had this sort of bumblebee plot where the vertical axis is days on the schedule, the horizontal axis is the number of hours you were shifting, and a vertical slice was the schedule you were supposed to follow. I put that purple line there around a 3-hour delay, and you can see there's like a lot of darkness. You would basically stay in the dark for like the first third of the day, get a little bit of light, and then go back into the dark. That's a consequence of optimizing only for time entrainment and not for anything else. But it was a tricky figure to parse to extract information for it. So I made an app. It was called Entrain, and the idea of Entrain was to communicate the content of that previous figure, but just in a way that was a little more human understandable. Entrain's still out there. It's free, and people can opt in to share their data. We get like this steady stream of people sending their data in to this day, which is amazing because I haven't updated it in a long time. And what it was doing under the hood was simulating that Vanderpool oscillator model on the phone. And for lighting history, because that model needs to eat lighting history, it was assuming that you are either on a default schedule or following recommendations given by the app exactly, unless you went in and manually overrode what the lighting was. So you could go and you can edit that. And the reason for this was, well, hey, what if people couldn't perfectly follow the schedule? What if they were following a schedule and then they were like, oh, I couldn't do this. I'm sorry. I couldn't stay in the dark until 2 p.m. on my trip from New York to California. That's a little too much devotion to optimal time shifting. And so the idea was people could enter their lighting history and the model would update accordingly. And this is a very blurry screenshot from a little trailer I made at the time introducing Entrain. And what people would do is they would tap on the places where it says light. They had 5 light options: dark, low indoor, bright indoor, low outdoor, bright outdoor. And they could just cycle through those to report hour by hour what their light exposure was. And I should say, I was not an experienced app developer at the time I made Entrain, and I'm still bowled over because it did get a lot of downloads. We got a lot of people opting in to share their data, and I'm so thankful for that. But I'm also especially thankful for people like this. So this is somebody who self-reported their lighting history for days. This is their self-reported lighting history, and again, there's only 5 tiers here. But they were doing it truly hour by hour, and up top you can see the Vanderpool oscillator model output that came from this self-reported lighting history. So there's this dashed gray line, that's the starting time zone that they diverged from, and the red curve shows what happens when you simulate the model with this self-reported lighting history. So this was amazing to see show up on our server, but it's also something that only the hardest of hardcore users will do. I don't know if you've seen app retention rate plots. They all look like this. They're all deeply depressing, where after a certain number of days, the fraction of people still using your app is minuscule. And you can see that after 1 day, you're down to a quarter. So it's not something that people are going to be likely to maintain for a long time. And circadian rhythms are something that's constantly happening. It's not that your circadian rhythm stops being important after 1 day. So how can we get people to engage continuously with a mobile app for circadian rhythms without burdening them with hour by hour lighting information? So in 2016, I was really starting to think, how can we get that kind of information without requiring manual input? And so later versions of Entrain did the following. You always could enter manual light information, but I pulled in wearable data as well. And I had a simple rule where I assumed you were following the light schedule or on your default schedule as before, unless the wearable data looked like you really weren't. So if, for instance, you were supposed to be in the dark, but you were moving around quite a bit, I would just bump you up either 1 or 2 levels in light. And it's a little hard to see here, but there's this yellow line right here in this screenshot, and you can see there's a lot of little yellow blips. That's because this is a version of Entrain where I lied to it. I told it I was in a different time zone. And so this is me going about my day, and it's saying, hey, I thought you were in the dark, but you're clearly moving around quite a bit. I'm going to bump your light exposure up. And every time it gets this modification to historical light exposure, it's dynamically changing the recommendations it gives. So that worked fairly well, but it was still a little bit undesirable in that it's sort of making this very huge assumption about what people are doing, which is that they're following their normal schedule or they're following the recommendations exactly as a baseline. So can we do some sort of measurement of circadian rhythms that is not so assumptive about what people are doing? And so I'm going to do a quick snapshot of wearables in 2021, starting with this plot. It's from Statista. It's market share split up by wearables. The first thing you should notice about this plot is that for some reason, a couple years seem to exceed 100%. I don't know why. That's a mystery from Statista. But the broad story from this, I think, is that a lot of wearables you might have heard about, and we're talking specifically in the consumer space, so no actigraphy, they sound or you feel like they probably have a bigger market share than they actually do. So I have a Fitbit, I have a Garmin. I'm like, lots of people have Fitbits and Garmins, but you'll see Fitbit is this light green here, Garmin is this dark purple, and both of them aren't even being plotted in the most recent years. So they, or at least the most recent quarters, they've really got a pretty small slice of the pie. And I think maybe the most surprising thing is that Apple consistently since 2019 has had about a third of consumer wearables, which is remarkable because you need an Apple device in order to be able to use an Apple Watch. Just a note about all consumer wearables at this stage. They're very different. I kind of feel like we're at that point after you go through a toll where there's a bunch of cars on the road. You're all heading the same direction, but there aren't any lanes. That's, to me, what the state of consumer wearable feels like right now. So each of them has a different way of exporting the data. Each of them decides what a step is in a different manner. They have different rules for accessing the data. Like, do you ping their API directly? Can you pull from a clearinghouse app like Apple Health? And they also have different standards for use. So Apple Watch people usually charge at night, whereas Fitbit, Garmin are more set up for continuous wear. And a quick note, most of them make raw access to raw data nearly impossible, though you can get raw acceleration from Apple devices. You just have to write some extra code to get that. So you might say, like, well, we want something that people are going to wear continuously. And that was my thinking too. Like, let's get the thing with the longest battery life, but I've kind of shifted. And that's because you don't actually have to have a watch to get activity data. Phones themselves pick up activity data. So this is registering that I am active at this point just by virtue of me moving it, even though I'm not wearing a watch. And I think you're much more likely to go a day or weeks without putting on a watch, especially after the novelty's gone, than you are to go a day without using your phone. So I'm a big proponent of using data from, you might call them nearables, things that aren't actually strapped to your body, but are giving a reflection of your activity patterns, because I think missing data is part of the landscape, and using something you always interact with as a proxy is going to be a better bet than relying on continuous watch wear. Okay, but a unique problem for circadian rhythms is that none of these devices are giving you access to raw light data, but there's an asterisk there, so I'm going to come back to this later. How well can you do with proxy light? So light that is not a direct measurement, but that you are estimating from other signals. Well, a few years ago, after I crashed on his couch at SRBR, I started collaborating with Philip Chang at Henry Ford. He's amazing. And he collected dim light melatonin onset data from shift workers. And it's just unbelievable, the coverage around the clock of these people's dilmos. There's like one bald spot here from like, I guess like 8 to pretty close to noon. But other than that, he had people with melatonin onset times almost around the clock. And being a good modeler, I said, hey, let me get out my Vanderpool oscillator of choice and let me take your light from the actigraphy of the shift workers and start passing it in as alpha of I right here, and then extracting dilmo timing and seeing how we do. And I said I was doing this, but really it was Pepper Huang. I had some of the original ideas around this, but the person who really got this work across the finish line and did an amazing job at it is Pepper. She's currently a postdoc at Northwestern. And what she got when she compared not just the Forger 1999 model, but many Vanderpool oscillator models and the Kevin Haney's Ott-Antonsen reduction model that I'm a huge fan of, but it's a limit cycle. It's just not a Vanderpool limit cycle oscillator. Was that like, okay, it did a decent job at predicting Dilmo through the model when we passed in light from actigraphy, though there's this sort of consistent problem where the late Dilmos aren't late enough and the early Dilmos aren't early enough. It's too flat. But I mentioned I had some of the early ideas. Here's the early idea I had. This is my contribution, which is to think, well, you don't usually work out in the dark. So light and activity are correlated. They're not linearly correlated, but there's a relationship between them. So what happens if in our model, we instead pass a proxy light from activity counts taken from actigraphy into alpha of I and extract Dilmo timing from that? And what you get is better prediction of real Dilmo. This line with slope 1, more things are fitting in the band around it. And the mean absolute error when you do just raw light is around 3.5 hours for the shift work population. Whereas when you use activity, you're looking more at 2.5 hours. And I think the natural thing to ask is, okay, why? And the two theories I kick around most are, number one, that activity-derived proxy light is actually closer to what you're getting at the eye. And the reasons for that are many. Like this was data collected from Michigan. Michigan is cold. People wear sleeves. Sleeves can cover light sensors, but they can't prevent the recording of activity counts. Theory number two, activity is itself a Zeitgeber. So maybe activity-derived light is somehow catching both. It's saying, hey, you're probably not working out in the dark, so I'm getting some sort of estimate of your light exposure, but also you did a really intense workout here, so maybe I'm capturing phase shifting effects from that as well. My personal beliefs is it's mostly theory 1 and maybe a little theory 2, though this needs to be tested. There's a lot more work to be done here. If you would like to be part of this work, we've dumped the code from that paper on GitHub. We've also made a open source JavaScript tool. It integrates Melissa St. Hilaire's 2007 model. It's just running Runga 4 with JavaScript, and you can just upload an actigraphy file there. I also want to point people to the HCR SymPy package by Kevin Haney, because it's got all the models, at least all the ones that we looked at in that paper in Python, so you can compare and contrast their different performances. Okay, so wrapping up, what's next? Well, I had that asterisk from before, and I wanted to say that you actually can get ambient light from Apple using SensorKit. This is my data from yesterday. So ambient lux and chromaticity are the things it gives you. You can only access it with a 24-hour delay. So you can get yesterday's light data, and it requires special permission from Apple, and it must be IRB approved. So if anyone's interested with an IRB approved study in collecting this kind of data, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to share experiences and code related to scraping this data. There's also a social rhythms project that I'm working on with Danny Forger that just is collecting wearable data from consenting users and key event timing, like for instance, when they started social distancing. So this is model-derived Dilmo, and this blue dashed line is the time they started social distancing. I love this plot, and if we had more time, I would dive into it, but I highly recommend checking out the paper on this that just came out, I think in Frontiers. But what I am doing most days is running a startup, trying to translate circadian rhythms into the real world. with a truly awesome team of developers, and Kevin Hane is my CTO. So I'm going to blitz through these really quickly. We have an app that simulates limit cycle oscillator models. We have an app that makes lighting recommendations for cancer patients. We have an app in development for shift workers. It tracks Stilmo through wearable signals. You can see this is me yesterday. I got up early, so it advanced me slightly. My final point is that I've encountered a lot of conversation, a lot of viewpoints and conversations with business type people. Some of their takes on the importance of sleep and circadian rhythms, I think, are just not right. But one thing I think somebody said that really resonated with me that I just want to pass along here is that for people just coming to this world, they're not choosing limit cycle model A over limit cycle model B. They're choosing to do something to fix their circadian rhythms versus nothing at all. That's the hurdle we're crossing, is something versus nothing. But I think that's still huge because there's this massive human suffering that could be reduced if we started paying more attention to our circadian clocks. So that's it. Thank you so much.